We had Zeenat ji who had a question. We have Feroz who has a question. Anyone else who has a question? 3, 4, 5.
Hello, sir. I'm Amritanshu Shekhar from Government Law College. My question is that isn't national identity, which puts restrictions on individuals in the form of borders, in the form of like various obligations that countries impose on their citizens, also contradictory to the idea of secularism and to the idea of freedom? So that's all. That's my question.
Thank you, sir, for that absolutely brilliant lecture. Every time I read what you write, I'm awake at least for one week thinking about what you've written. So my question is that today the identity politics, you see, my own identity is I'm a Xavierite. I've studied here, I've taught here for several years, and I'm a professor of Islamic studies. Besides being a woman, of course, that's the first identity. But what I need to ask you is that, you know, this entire identity issue, which is revolving around religion, you know, Hinduism versus Hindutva, and the kind of propagandist ideologies that are being spread, to me as a very humble student of religion, and thank you for that moment of enlightenment that you spoke about. I think that's what we are all looking for. And how is there in our form of secularism, like in the West, is there any way of turning this conversation around and removing religion from the public domain? What we need is a proper secular understanding of individuals, of our rights, of our constitution, which should be the holy book, and removal of everything else that has happened and is happening. Thank you.
Yes, I must thank Irfan. Like Zeenat, ma'am, I too am a fan of your writing. So we really need to thank Irfan for doing this. I think you've taken the debate on secularism ahead, where you brought in the concept of justice and individuality into the entire thing, into your discourse. Basically, secularism is the process by where the state negotiates between communities and between religions. So that is where actually, so you just can't discard religion from the public sphere, I believe. It's a matter of negotiating and creating structures. The other is, as you said, we need to take secularism beyond the dominant discourse of communal harmony and Sarvadharam Samabhav, which Gandhiji and the freedom movement did bring in, which is very important. But I think where we as secularists have kind of fallen is not taken enough after what Gandhiji, Ambedkar and Nehru himself did in terms of the critique of religions, and we really fell way behind in our critique of Islam and the way we should have taken on political Islam as we did the political project of Hindutva. So that is why on the issue of reform, you see conservative Hindus and Muslims all talking the same language of pluralism and diversity, but never referred once to the constitutional values of equality and justice, which you have linked to secularism. Lastly, I'd say that the nation states were a logical, they emerged out of the anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggles. So that phase we are going through, and as you have pointed out to the dangers of the European model, but now what is interestingly happening, we are going into the post-colonial phase of the creation of blocks across the world. In South Asia, we don't have a bloc, but there are blocks of nations. ASEAN has proved to be very successful, the European Union at a certain level. Interestingly, in Africa, where we are witnessing the decolonization at a fast pace, the anti-French agenda there, we are moving towards the United States of Africa. So now, from the nation state, we are moving to the blocks, and in the integration of nations, cultures and religions, we have something new that is emerging, and that is what we need to theorize and watch. Yeah.
Good evening, Professor Mehta, Professor Puniyani, and other dignitaries. I am Vishwas Fatehpuria. I'm a lawyer and also student of Masters of Public Policy at St. Xavier's College, Bombay. My question is in light of whatever you shared, the information that you shared with all of us, in light of multiple form of identities, like you mentioned Indians in a broad sense or a Xavierite at an institutional level, and collectiveness of individuals as seen in the theory of social contract that gives rise to the modern national state or institution that exists with the functional positive law, constitutional morality, and the state of jingoism that exists currently in the contemporary times in the country. What do you see as the future that comes post-modern national state in the constitutional sovereignty? So I would really like your views on that.
Good morning, everyone. I had two questions. First is that though you emphasized a lot on individuality and everything, but my question goes back to Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who, as being a Hindu, he observed that there is something wrong which is going on around about sati and everything. So he, as an individual, was not going through anything because he was male, but women were going through this problem. And so as a community, he thought about that. Similarly, the PILs which are being filed up and up on Supreme Courts, they are based on a community problem. If a person doesn't belong, still, for example, Vishakha guidelines and all, they all came through PILs. They were not individual based. So I do understand there is an emphasis on individuality and everything. But I just have a question that what kind of power, as an individuality gives you a power to question the community. So can you also question communities which you are not part of? And what are the repercussions of the same?
Thank you very much. I was thinking that we are looking at, I work on the concept of minority, and I was thinking that we are looking at minority very narrowly, and I was trying to look at the structure, how to start looking at minority in wider perspective, what all is influencing it. So that way you have given me interesting insights. But where I'm feeling, or I'm a little uncomfortable, maybe I've not understood you properly, it's difficult. You shared very complex ideas, as you yourself stated. So I might be completely wrong in understanding you, but what I'm thinking is that you're talking about identity and individuality. Now, I'm a student of sociology. In sociology, individual is created through socialization with lots of social structures, and they cannot, it's inculcated in them and they cannot negate it totally. Then you are saying that this individual should rationally decide its own terms of reference as far as relating it to, relating themselves to the other collectives and other structure. Now, these terms of reference an individual can decide, but as others have also asked, do they have freedom to exercise it? Especially when you yourself have talked about the constraints of otherness, which is coming up on the individuals. What I'm trying to say, and it is lost because my mobile phone is switched off, but what I'm trying to say is that somehow or other, the way you are describing rational individual, escaping the identity trap, and which will help us in developing secularism, which will be again very rationally defined in terms of individual freedom, I somewhere feel that we are, I'm sorry for using the word, I'm very sorry, are we not getting into a very utopian plane?
Good evening, sir. It was just a coincidence that I began to subscribe to a magazine, which you probably know as Swarajya. And for some reason, I had a disdain, of course. And I used to receive copies, and for some reason, I kept 2 copies to be read later. And just a couple of days, it's a coincidence, my wife said, why don't you trash all these old newspapers and magazines out? And I opened that magazine, and you will recall, there were 3 things on that. And the headlines, the cover page was Identity Matters. You probably know it. So in that Identity Matters, I never even opened the book, the magazine, I kept it there. So when I saw Identity Matters, You were also featured on that magazine for the wrong reasons. And the third, interesting, where I tried to learn what is called wokeism and woke culture. Do you think the prevalence of woke culture, anti-woke culture, is coming back to India or is being propagandized in India in a very big way? Thank you.
I just wanted to say that it seems to me that right-wing Hindus see themselves as victims in India and as minorities in the global arena. And I think these two factors affect the whole aspect of, this very strong adherence to religious identity. So I would like you to comment on that, whether you agree, disagree.
Thank you. I'm tempted to learn from you and keep you here all evening, but I won't succumb to the temptation. So let me begin with the last question, because again, I think it's a good segue into the other ones. So, one of the questions we need to ask, right? So your description of Hindu nationalism is spot on, right? And not just Hindu nationalism, if you look at the global context, pretty much most identities at this point think of themselves as embattled or victims of some other identity, including the most privileged, it's a kind of, it's a pervasive condition, right? Now the question for us is, what produces that condition? One answer, which I think is partially right, is a surface answer. A lot of propaganda, WhatsApp groups telling you wrong history, textbooks teaching you wrong things, all kinds of modes of socialization where we have convinced ourselves, not just that, Hindus were victims, but, Hindus are daily insecure, more insecure than anybody else, etc., right? But there is another possible answer to that, and this is something I probably not very well was trying to hint at. That it is inherent in the way we currently think of identities, right? That those identities will try and naturalize themselves and stabilize themselves, right? That they somehow are objective facts, right? That somehow they can be given a meaning that can be benchmarked, because otherwise they don't perform the functions they are supposed to, right? The functions of clarity, the functions of solidarity, the functions of, right, whatever kind of goods that come from those identities. So one of the reasons, let's put it this way, I'm kind of identity skeptic from a human point of view, right, from a psychological point of view, is that inherent in the very process of constructing that identity, you will find anything that destabilizes it a threat to it, right? The threats we are finding are overdetermined. These are not going to be cured by better history or better facts. In fact, our history and facts are determined by our identity, not the other way around, right? They are actually determined by the need to stabilize that identity and that privilege, right? It's the very abstract nature of that identity that allows it to see fear at every step, right? Do I have reason to fear you sitting in front of me? No, right? Muslims, I have fear, right? So it's precisely that process of abstraction, which is why this is overdetermined. It's not going to be cured by better history. Both the left and right are running a fool's errand trying to argue this case on better history, right? So that's, I think, the first thing. The second thing, I think, which cuts to 3 or 4 of the questions. So at the risk of being provocative, let me say this. I think from a public point of view and from the point of view of justice and secularism, getting into the debate over religion is actually pointless and beside the point, right? First of all, the distinction between what is religious and what is secular is itself going to be adjudicated by a sovereign power that is secular. It's a distinction internal to secular power. It is not a self-evident given distinction, right? Second, right, this debate, which our Supreme Court dearly loves, right, I think it's terrible jurisprudence. What is the true essence of a religion? And if we only understood it, we will be nudged to the right path, right? Now, it's true in certain cases the authority of religion can help. It might help some people to say, look, your book actually means this when you take it to mean X. But you know, that again is that same process of objectification. I mean, as if to say, if your book did not mean this, it would be okay for you to do that, right? So, to my mind, religion, particularly because it matters to people, and I think this was the beauty of our constitution, it says, let's not burden public debate with this argument about what is true or false religion. That is exactly the open-ended quest that each individual has to engage in for it to be authentic, right? So, you know, true Islam doesn't teach this, true Hinduism doesn't teach this, right? Again, a fool's paradise. I mean, that's a fool's errand in some ways, right? The important thing that is happening to religion in our context is that religion, in some senses, has been colonized by nationalism, right? What Hindutva represents is not whether Hindutva is true Hinduism or not, right? I mean, again, if you believe in self-definition, who am I to benchmark your Hinduism for you, right? What Hindutva does, in some ways, is it says that, look, there is an ethnicization of identity, right? And remember, it's its compulsoriness. When Hindutva says you're all Hindu, the only problem is some of you don't recognize it and therefore we can beat you up for it, right? It's that imposition of the compulsory character of that identity, right? Where you're not allowed to say, I'm not Hindu, or I'm not Hindu on the terms that you think constitutes being a true Hindu, right? It's the compulsoriness of it, right? Which is what it shares with nationalism, right? Which is what makes it amenable to imposition by state power, right? So, and which is what makes it amenable to democratic politics, because after all, the concept of majority, right, actually is a problem. It doesn't arise out of colonialism, it arises out of democracy, right? A majority can be defined as a fixed majority only if you say there is a compulsory identity that a majority of these people have that can be enumerated as Hindu, and there's a bunch of other people who can be enumerated as Muslims or whatever caste and so forth, right? It arises out of the need of representation. I mean, one thing we don't often talk about, I think the language of representation is actually quite fatal to democracy. Democracy is a mode of authorization. We, through a certain voting mechanism, authorize certain people to take certain decisions and we hold them accountable, right? But the minute we get into representation, you represent me, right? I'm again presuming some logic of identity. You represent me qua Hindu, you represent me qua this caste, right? So it's actually that colonization by nationalism and its compulsoriness, right? That's the insidious trap Hindutva puts us into. So the sanity is in refusing the question. It's not saying, let me tell you a better Hinduism. Let me benchmark you to a better Hinduism. It could be empowering. It's not a bad thing to do in private contexts, right? But that question will itself become a trap, right? And so it's that, and that's why that radical utopian urge, absolutely right, but then no transcendence ever happens without a utopian urge. Otherwise, what are you condemned to? The facticity of what exists, right? That's exactly the thing which I was talking about, right? Where the irony that as democrats, as secularists, As people who believe in freedom, we want to create a world whose terms we can accept, and we can accept as free and equal citizens. But that's exactly the thing we want to give up. In some senses, when we say, look, in some senses, this is true. Freedom is not incompatible with identities. What it will produce is, you might say, less vicarious, less abstract, right? In some senses, more livable identities than these scripted abstractions to which we are condemning ourselves. And I guess maybe I'm not convinced you, the purpose was not to say let's move to a utopian future. The nation state is not going to be transcended. But we can actually create frames in which to invoke Tagore and Gandhi, the two great post-nationalist thinkers, right? We start treating these as matters of facts that don't have to colonize and frame everything we do and think.